There are places on this earth where the ground has kept a face, and where that face staring out across the centuries seems to be waiting for someone to answer a question no one alive can quite remember how to ask. Imagine standing before one now, not a statue in the way we usually mean the word, not a figure with arms and legs and a body, but a head, a human face, colossal, carved from a single block of stone that no cart could carry and no crane of its age could lift. The lips are full and slightly parted. The eyes are half-lidded, heavy with something between judgment and sleep. Above the brow sits a helmet, tight and deliberate, incised with markings whose meaning has dissolved into silence, and the stone is dark, almost black, most. It drinks the light rather than reflecting it, so that even at midday the face seems to carry its own private dusk, as though it remembers a fire older than any of us can name. You're looking at a person. That is the uncanny thing. Not a god's abstraction, not a symbol, but an individual. Someone who lived, who ruled, who wore a real face that a sculptor studied and translated into 40 tons of volcanic rock more than 2,500 years ago. And the closer you stand, the stranger the sensation becomes, because the face does not feel dead. It feels merely still, patient, as if the man inside the stone has simply decided not to speak today. The first of these faces to reach the wider world came out of the ground in the year 1862, in the humid lowlands of Mexico's Gulf Coast, at a place called Tres Zapotes. A traveller named José Melgar, following local reports of something strange half buried in a field, arrived to find what he later described as an enormous head, part of it still swallowed by the earth. He had expected, perhaps, a curiosity, a boulder shaped by weather, a fragment of some colonial folly. Instead, he found a face gazing up out of the soil, its features so distinct, so plainly and powerfully human, that he could not reconcile it with anything he knew of the ancient Americas. It did not fit the story the 19th century had told itself about who had lived here and what they had been capable of. And so it began its long career as an enigma, a face that should not, by the assumptions of its discoverers, have existed at all. We now know that Melgar had stumbled onto the edge of something vast. 17 of these colossal heads have since been confirmed across the Olmec heartland of the Gulf Coast, the oldest of them carved by at least 900 BCE, and some perhaps 3 centuries older still. They weigh up to 44 tons. They rise as tall as a standing man and taller, and they were made by a people who possessed no wheel, no draft animals, no metal tools of any kind. They were pounded and abraded into being with stone striking stone, with wet sand and patience and hollow reeds, out of basalt sourced from mountains more than 50 miles away, mountains from which every one of these enormous boulders had to be moved somehow, across a landscape of swamp and flooding river to the places where they now rest. That is the beginning of the puzzle, but it is only the beginning. For what makes the Olmec heads so haunting is not that they are unique, but that they are not. Across the world, in cultures that never met, that never traded a word or a tool or an idea, that were separated by whole oceans and by thousands of years, human beings did the same impossible thing again and again. They found the hardest, heaviest stone their land could offer. They quarried it in places that made no logistical sense. They dragged it across terrain that ought to have defeated them, and then, with tools we would consider hopelessly inadequate, they carved into that stone the one image that seems to have obsessed our species from its earliest days, the human face, made monumental, made eternal, made to watch. This is the journey we're about to take. It begins in the Mexican swamps with the Olmec, whose basalt heads set the pattern for everything that follows. From there we travel south, into the high Andean cloud forest of Colombia, to San Agustin, where an entire nameless civilization left behind hundreds of stone watchers with fanged jaguar mouths, guarding tombs whose owners we cannot name. We cross the Pacific to the most remote inhabited island on the planet, Easter Island, where the moai of Ranararaku, some weighing as much as 80 tons, were somehow moved miles across broken volcanic ground by a people who had no wheels and no animals to pull them. We travelled to the ruins of Ayutthaya in Thailand, where a single sandstone Buddha head, severed and abandoned, has been slowly embraced over centuries by the roots of a living tree, until stone and wood have become one face. And finally we climbed to the summit of Nemrut Dağ in eastern Turkey, more than 2,000 metres into the thin cold air, where a forgotten king had colossal limestone heads of himself and his gods raised on an artificial mountain of crushed rock, only for time and earthquake to topple them and scatter them across the peak. 5 cultures, 5 landscapes, 5 faces, or 5,000, and running through all of them, like a thread pulled taut across the whole surface of the globe, 3 recurring impossibilities. The first is sourcing, the sheer difficulty of finding, quarrying and freeing stone of this scale and this hardness from the living rock of a mountain, without steel, without explosives, without the machinery we take for granted. The second is transport. The question that has broken more scholarly reputations than perhaps any other in this field. How do you move something that weighs as much as a loaded truck, sometimes more, across swamp, across mountains, across open terrain, when you have no wheel and no beast of burden and only the strength of human bodies and the leverage of wood and rope? And the third is precision, the almost unbearable refinement of the carving itself, the fact that these faces are not crude approximations but deliberate, controlled, individual works of art, achieved with instruments that modern sculptors, when handed the same materials and told to try, quietly admit they cannot match. That last point is the one that ought to keep you awake. It is one thing for us to marvel at the ancients from a comfortable distance, imagining them as simple people who accomplish simple things through brute effort and endless time. It is quite another to hand a professional stone carver of the 21st century a block of the same basalt, the same volcanic rock, along with only the tools those ancient hands are believed to have used, and to watch them fail. Not fail for lack of skill, these are masters, but fail for lack of understanding. Something was known then that is not known now. Some technique, some sequence, some relationship between hand and stone and material has slipped out of the record, and it did not slip out once. It slipped out across continents that had no contact, again and again, as if each of these cultures reached a threshold of mastery and then vanished before it could be written down. What was it that they understood? And why, so consistently, does the knowledge seem to disappear with them? Let us begin where Melga began, in the hot green lowlands of the Gulf Coast, and descend into the heartland of the Olmec. To reach the country of the colossal heads, you must go down. Down from the highland Mexico of the imagination, the dry plateaus and the pyramids of later empires, into a low, wet, sweltering world, where the rivers braid and wander, and the air hangs thick enough to feel on your skin. This is the Gulf Coast lowland, a floodplain of black soil and dense vegetation laced by great slow rivers, chief among them the Coatzacoalcos, which winds through the region like an artery. It is a landscape of abundance and of obstruction in equal measure. The soil is rich, the water endless, the growth relentless, and it is here, at the sites we now call San Lorenzo and La Venta, that the Olmec raised the first great civilization of Mesoamerica, more than 3,000 years ago, and here that they left their most famous and most confounding monuments. At first, the ruins do not announce themselves. San Lorenzo sits on a raised plateau above the surrounding wetlands, an elevation partly natural and partly, it seems, shaped by human hands into terraces and platforms. La Venta rises from an island of higher ground amid the swamps, crowned by one of the earliest large pyramids in the Americas. You could walk across these places and see, at first glance, only mounds and jungle, and the ordinary green disorder of the tropics, and then you come upon a face. It sits low to the ground, massive, weathered, its dark basalt streaked by centuries of rain, and the ordinary world falls away because you're no longer looking at a ruin. You are being looked at. The heads are portraits. That is the scholarly consensus, and it is a startling one when you dwell on it. Each of the 17 confirmed colossal heads is individualized. No two are alike. Each wears a distinct helmet-like covering, snug against the skull, sometimes decorated with its own particular emblems and patterns, as though each headdress were a badge of office or a mark of personal identity. The faces themselves have their own characters: broad noses, full lips, cheeks heavy or lean, expressions that range from stern to serene. The prevailing interpretation is that these are the likenesses of rulers, specific, powerful men whose authority was such that their features were fixed forever in the hardest stone their world could provide. To carve a portrait in basalt is to make a claim about eternity. These faces were meant to outlast their subjects, and they have, by nearly 3,000 years and counting. They are enormous. The largest stand as much as 11 feet tall and weigh, by careful estimate, up to 40 tons. Some accounts push higher, to more than 44. Even the smaller examples run to several tons. To stand at the base of one is to feel the true meaning of the word colossal, not as a description but as a physical pressure, a mass looming over you that your instincts insist could not have been raised by human effort alone. And yet it was. Every one of these heads was worked by hand, from a single block of stone, by people who had no metal with which to cut it. But before a single blow could be struck, the stone had to be found. And this is where the first of our three impossibilities takes hold with a grip that has never quite loosened. The basalt of the Olmec heads did not come from the swampland where the heads now sit. There is no such stone there. The lowland is soft soil and sediment for miles in every direction. The basalt came from the Tuxtla Mountains, a volcanic range rising to the northwest, and principally from the slopes of a peak the sources name as Cerro Sintepec. There, and only there, was the dense, dark volcanic rock the Olmec seemed to have insisted upon. They did not settle for whatever hard stone lay closest. They went to the mountains, to a specific place on a specific volcanic slope, and they chose this particular basalt, vesicular, pitted with the frozen bubbles of ancient gas, black as the inside of the earth. Why this stone? The practical answer is that it was hard and durable, suited to monuments meant to endure. But some researchers have wondered whether the choice ran deeper than practicality. One scholar has suggested that the consistent selection of this dark volcanic rock served as a kind of message, a compelling reminder, in the very substance of the monument, of underworld power expressed through volcanism. Consider what that would mean. The Olmec lived in a landscape shaped by fire from below. The mountains that gave them their stone were the same mountains that could, in living memory or in inherited legend, roar and burn and reshape the world. To carve the face of a ruler from the frozen blood of a volcano would be to fuse the man with the deepest and most terrifying power the land possessed. Whether this was the intention, we cannot know with certainty, but the possibility lingers, and it changes the way the faces look at you. Whatever the reason, the choice created a problem of staggering dimensions. The quarry lay more than 50 miles from the ceremonial centres, by many estimates 60 miles or more, and for some heads perhaps as far as 90. And between the mountain and the monument lay some of the least forgiving terrain imaginable for moving heavy loads: swamp, marsh, seasonally flooding floodplain, and the braided channels of the river system. There was no road in our sense. There was no wheel to roll the load along. There were no oxen, no horses, no draft animals of any kind. None existed in the Americas at that time. There was no iron, no bronze, nothing harder than stone and wood and the muscle and ingenuity of human beings. And into this equation the Olmec introduced boulders weighing as much as 40 tons and moved them, whole, across the better part of 100 miles. How? The honest answer is that no one is certain. The leading theories are elegant, and each of them is also, on close inspection, deeply uneasy. The most favoured proposes that the boulders were floated. The The Coatzacoalcos river system offered a natural highway of water threading through the swamps, and it has long been suggested that the Olmec built massive rafts, great platforms of balsa, the lightest and most buoyant wood available to them, and floated the stone downstream toward its destination. It is a beautiful idea. Water does what human backs cannot. It carries weight almost for free, and yet the moment one examines it closely, the difficulties multiply. Recent maritime engineering analyses have questioned the sheer viability of the raft solution when the numbers are taken seriously. A 40-ton block does not sit gently on a raft. It demands an enormous, precisely balanced vessel, one that must be loaded and unloaded without capsizing or crushing itself. And rivers do not flow only where you wish them to. Part of the journey, depending on the route, may have required moving against the current or across stretches of open or standing water where a heavy raft becomes a heavy problem. How was such a vessel built, launched, steered, and brought safely to shore with its impossible cargo again and again 17 times and more? The water theory solves one problem and quietly opens a dozen others. On land, where the water could not reach, the favoured explanation is the log roller, the ancient and intuitive solution of laying rolling timbers beneath a heavy object and dragging it forward as the rollers turn. It is plausible in principle. Humanity has moved great weights this way in many places and many ages, and yet the Olmec terrain conspires against it. Log rollers demand a firm, relatively level surface. They mire and sink in soft ground, and the Gulf Coast lowland is nothing if not soft. Dragging a 40-ton boulder across swampland on rollers, uphill from the quarry slopes and then across yielding floodplain, would require not only immense human labour, but the constant construction of firm causeways or trackways ahead of the load, an entire secondary engineering project running invisibly beneath the visible one. And behind both theories stands the third and simplest: sheer human labour, organised on a scale that itself becomes a kind of mystery. How many hands, how many days, how much food and water and coordination did it take to move a single head? What kind of society, what depth of organisation and shared purpose could summon that effort not once but repeatedly, for monuments that served no obvious practical function beyond the perpetuation of a ruler's face? Every proposed answer works well enough on paper and falters somewhere in the mud. And this is the pattern we will meet again and again on our journey. The mainstream explanations are not foolish. They are careful, considered, the product of genuine expertise. Rafts and rollers and human labour almost certainly played their part. No one seriously proposes that the heads floated into place by magic, but almost is the operative word. The theories account for most of the problem and leave a residue of doubt that will not dissolve, a gap between what we can demonstrate and what actually happened, a gap into which the imagination inevitably pours. Could there have been methods we have not reconstructed, techniques so thoroughly lost that we cannot even recognize their traces? Were the rivers different then, the routes shorter, the loads distributed in ways we have failed to imagine? Or did the Olmec simply possess a mastery of the marriage between water, wood, and weight that we, with all our machinery, have never needed to learn and therefore cannot see? The heads keep their silence, and that silence is not empty. It is full. Then there is the carving itself, which is a marvel apart from the moving. Once the boulder had reached its destination, or perhaps was worked at the source, though the scholarly debate on that point continues, the sculptors faced the task of transforming a rough mass of one of the hardest stones on earth into a subtle, individualized human face, complete with the delicate lines of a headdress and the modelled softness of lips and eyelids. And they did this without a single metal tool. The prevailing understanding is that they worked by percussion, striking the stone with harder stone hammers to knock away material, and by abrasion, grinding the surface down with wet sand, and drilling with hollow reeds spun against the rock, sand carrying the cut deeper turn by turn. It is a method of infinite patience. Basalt does not yield willingly. It does not cleave along easy planes like softer stone. Every feature had to be coaxed out of it by the slow marriage of grit and time. To grasp what this means, it helps to reach for a comparison. We speak of the achievements of the ancient world in a certain register of respectful astonishment. The fitted masonry of the Inca, in which stones weighing many tons are joined so tightly that a blade cannot slip between them, the great pyramids of Egypt, the Roman concrete that has outlasted the empire that poured it. The Olmec heads belong in that company, and in some ways they exceed it, for they combine the logistical nightmare of transporting immense weight with the fine art challenge of portraiture in one of the most unforgiving materials available. And like Roman concrete, like the secret of Damascus steel, the technique seems to have flourished and then faded from the record, leaving later peoples in the same land to build in different ways, with the mastery of the basalt heads unrepeated. The knowledge appeared. It worked magnificently, and then it slipped beneath the surface of history into the same silence the faces themselves keep. Standing at the foot of one of these heads, in the wet heat of the Gulf Coast, with the insects droning and the rivers moving unseen through the green, one cannot help but feel the weight of the unanswered question pressing down from that half-lidded gaze. Who were you? How did they bring you here? And what did they know, those hands that shaped you, that we have forgotten so completely we cannot even reconstruct it? The Olmecs set the pattern, and the pattern reaches far beyond their swamps. For if we now leave the lowlands behind and travel south, across the spine of a continent and up into the thin, cold air of the mountains, we will find that the impulse to carve a colossal face and set it watching over the dead was not theirs alone, and that in the cloud forests of Colombia, the mystery does not diminish. It deepens until we do not even know the names of those who carved. But we've already stood among the guardians of the cloud forest and felt how their silence differed from the Olmec silence, an anonymity so complete that not even a ruler's name survives to be spoken. Now the tour must cross a wider gulf than any river or mountain range. It must cross an ocean. For if the problem of moving stone haunts every stop on this journey, there is one place on Earth where that problem reaches a scale that borders on the fantastical, a place so isolated that its very existence seems to argue against the possibility of what stands there. Our path turns west, out across the vast emptiness of the Pacific, toward the loneliest inhabited speck of land in the world. There, rising from the swell of the southern sea, lies a triangle of volcanic rock the people who settled it called Rapa Nui, and which the outside world came to know as Easter Island. It is small, wind-scoured, treeless across much of its surface, ringed by cliffs where the ocean beats without rest, and yet scattered across this modest island, standing sentinel along its coasts and slopes, are nearly 900 colossal stone figures, the Moai, some of them among the largest freestanding statues any human culture has ever raised. To arrive here, whether by the long sea voyage of the Polynesian navigators who first found it, or by the eye of the modern imagination, is to confront a question that has troubled every visitor since the first outsiders set foot on the shore. How, on this remote and impoverished rock, did so few people make so many giants and move them so far? The answer begins not on the coast, but at the island's beating heart, at an extinct volcanic crater called Rano Raraku. This was the factory, the quarry, the birthplace of the Moai. From its slopes of compressed volcanic tuff, a soft, workable stone, the ash of ancient eruptions fused into rock, the islanders carved roughly 95% of all the statues on the island, between around 1250 and 1500 of the Common Era. To walk the flanks of Rano Raraku today is to walk through an interrupted moment, a workshop frozen at the instant its workers set down their tools and never returned. Heads emerge from the grassy slopes at every angle, buried to the neck by centuries of silt washed down the hill, their long faces tilted toward the sky. And on the quarry walls themselves, still lying where they were being born, are statues that were never finished. figures carved in relief into the living bedrock waiting to be detached, still joined to the mountain by a spine of uncut stone along their backs. Among these unfinished giants lies the one they call El Gigante, the giant, and its dimensions stop the breath. Had it ever been completed and stood upright, it would have reached some 69 feet in height and weighed an estimated 200 metric tons. It is a statue conceived on a scale that no one on the island could plausibly have moved, a reach that exceeded even their own extraordinary grasp. And yet there it lies, half emerged from the rock, evidence of an ambition that seems to have outrun the limits of the possible. Why carve something so vast that it could never be raised? Was it faith, or pride, or a competition of workshops each striving to outdo the last? Or did the carvers themselves believe that the impossible was merely the not yet achieved, that the stone would find its way to the coast as all its brothers had, by means we still cannot fully explain? The unfinished giant keeps its silence buried in the slope, and the grass grows over it as it has for 5 centuries. For the finished Moai did leave the quarry. That is the heart of the mystery. These were not carved where they were meant to stand. They were made at Rano-Raraku and then transported, miles in many cases across broken volcanic terrain, to the coastal platforms the islanders called Ahu, the ceremonial stages on which the statues were finally raised to watch over the settlements of the living, their backs to the sea, their faces turned inward toward the land. The average Moai weighs around 14 tons. The largest ever successfully erected, a figure called Pero, stood some 33 feet tall and weighed a staggering 82 tons. And every one of them had to travel from the crater to the coast without wheels, without draft animals, without metal, moved by a population that at its height was never large, on an island that offered no obvious means of hauling such colossal weights across such distances. Here the impossibility that has shadowed us since the Gulf Coast reaches its peak. The Olmec had rivers. The moving of basalt could at least be imagined floating on water for part of its journey. But Rapa Nui offered no rivers, no navigable inland routes, nothing but the hard volcanic ground itself and the muscle and ingenuity of the people who lived upon it. How were dozens of tons of stone made to travel across such a landscape? The question has drawn some of the most famous experiments in the history of archaeology, rival demonstrations by rival minds, each convinced they had found the answer, each leaving the deeper mystery only partly resolved. For much of the 20th century, the dominant image was one of dragging. The great Norwegian explorer Thor Heyerdahl, who brought Easter Island to the world's attention, championed the idea that the statues had been laid on their backs upon wooden sledges and hauled overland by teams of labourers, or rolled on wooden rollers, inch by grinding inch, from quarry to coast. It was a vision of brute collective effort, of ropes and timber and thousands of straining hands, and it carried within it a dark corollary, one that would come to dominate the story of the island for decades. If the statues were moved on wood, then the moving of 900 statues would have demanded a staggering quantity of trees, and Easter Island, when Europeans arrived, was almost entirely bare. From this arose the powerful and haunting narrative of self-inflicted catastrophe, that the islanders, in their obsessive drive to carve and transport ever more Moai, had felled their forests until nothing remained, stripping the land of the wood they needed to survive, triggering an ecological collapse, an ecocide, in which a civilization consumed the very ground beneath its feet, in service of its stone gods. It is a story of terrible poetic force, a parable of ruin, of a people undone by their own reverence, a warning stone-faced and silent across the sea. And yet, as with so much on this journey, the story that satisfies the moral imagination has come under serious challenge. More recent research has begun to dismantle the ecocide narrative, arguing that the picture of a population driven to collapse by its own excess simply does not fit the evidence as well as it once seemed to. Some scholars now suggest the island's people remained comparatively stable and resilient, that the deforestation had causes more complex than statue madness alone, and that the vision of a self-destroying society may say more about our own anxieties than about the Rapa Nui who actually lived and carved here. The collapse debate shadows the whole achievement, but it is a shadow, not a settled fact, and the ground beneath it continues to shift, and it shifts hardest of all around the question of how the statues moved. For the islanders themselves never spoke of sledges or rollers. Their own oral tradition, passed down across generations, held to something far stranger, far more marvellous, and long dismissed as mere legend. The statues, the tradition insisted, walked. They walked from the quarry to the coast, upright, under their own power or the power of the gods within them, moving across the land on their own broad bases. To the outside investigators of earlier decades, this was poetry, a charming myth, the way a people might dress up a lost engineering feat in the language of wonder. Yet what if the myth was not decoration? What if the islanders were describing, in the plainest possible terms, exactly what they did? This is the possibility that modern experimental archaeology has taken up most notably in the work of the researchers Terry Hunt and Carl Lipo. Studying the moai closely, they noticed features that had puzzled others, that the statues, in their transport-ready form, were engineered with a distinct forward lean, their centre of gravity pitched ahead, and that their bases were not flat but subtly D-shaped, curved and rounded along the front edge. These were not the proportions of a finished statue meant only to stand still upon a platform. They were, Hunt and Lipo argued, the proportions of a statue designed to move. A figure leaning forward, resting on a rounded base, will pivot from side to side if rocked, and a rocking, pivoting figure will, with each swing, edge forward. In other words, the moai was shaped to be walked. They tested it, attaching ropes to a full-scale replica, one from the left, one from the right, and one from behind to steady it. Small teams of people began to rock the standing statue back and forth, side to side, each swing carrying it a step forward along its curved base. And it worked. The statue walked. It moved upright across the ground in a swaying, deliberate gait, precisely as the oral tradition had always said. Most striking of all was how few people it required. Where the older theories imagined hundreds or thousands hauling on sledges, the walking method demanded remarkably little. As Dr. Lipo described it, the hard part is getting it rocking in the first place. Once you get it moving, it isn't hard at all. People are pulling with one arm. Teams as small as 18 were able to walk a multi-ton moai forward, step by rocking step, coaxing the giant along by rhythm rather than raw force. Consider what this reframes. If the moai walked, then the vast forests supposedly consumed to build sledges and rollers were never needed for that purpose at all, and one of the central pillars of the ecocide story weakens accordingly. If the moai walked, then the islanders were not brute force haulers, but engineers of a subtle and elegant kind, who understood weight and balance and momentum well enough to make a colossal stone figure dance its way across a landscape on the strength of a few pairs of arms. And if the moai walked, then the oral tradition, the thing dismissed for so long as mere legend, turns out to have been holding the literal truth in plain sight all along, the way the stones themselves have held their secrets, waiting for someone to listen rather than assume. And yet even the walking hypothesis does not close the question entirely. The demonstrations succeed on smoother, prepared ground and with statues of a certain size. Whether every one of the nearly 900 moai, across every mile of the island's rough volcanic terrain, in every stage of Rapa Nui's history, moved by this same graceful rocking is a matter on which room for doubt remains. Perhaps different statues moved by different means. Perhaps the technique was refined and lost and rediscovered across the centuries of carving. The walking may be the answer, or the best answer we yet have, or one answer among several. And standing on the windswept slope of Rano Raraku, among the half-buried heads gazing up at the racing clouds, one senses that the island is content to let us wonder. It gave us the myth. It gave us the D-shaped bases and the forward lean. It has told us, in its own way, how the statues walked. And still the full truth of that walking recedes, mile by mile toward the coast where the finished giants stand with their backs to the sea, keeping their own counsel as the surf breaks below them in the endless Pacific wind. From the peak of the impossible, we descend now to something quieter, and the change of register is deliberate, for the story of the colossal face is not only a story of building, it is also a story of ruin. And nowhere is that other half of the tale told more tenderly than in the ruined heart of a fallen kingdom, half a world away from the lonely rock in the Pacific, where a single carved face has been claimed not by human hands, but by the slow, patient reach of a living tree. Our journey turns now to Southeast Asia, to the plains of central Thailand and the ruins of Ayutthaya, once the glittering capital of the Siamese kingdom, a city of temples and palaces and gilded spires that European visitors of its golden age ranked among the great cities of the world. It was founded in splendor, and it ended in fire. At the temple called Wat Mahathat, a royal monastery whose origins reach back to its founding in 1374 by King Baroma Rashathirat I, there sits, among the toppled brick and the weathered stone, one of the most photographed and most quietly haunting images in all of Asia. The sandstone head of the Buddha, resting at ground level, cradled and slowly enveloped by the coiling roots of a Bodhi tree. The sacred fig, the very species beneath which the Buddha is said to have attained enlightenment. The head did not come to rest here gently. In 1767, after a long and grinding war, the Burmese army fell upon Ayutthaya and destroyed it. They burned the city systematically, and in an act calculated to break the spirit of a people, they moved through its sacred places, striking the heads from countless Buddha images, decapitating the statues that were the very centre of Siamese religious and civic life. To desecrate the Buddhas was to desecrate the kingdom itself, to demoralize the populace, to declare that the old order was finished. The great capital was abandoned to the elements, its ruins left to the encroaching vegetation, its severed stone faces scattered among the rubble. The head at Wat Mahathat is believed to be one of these casualties. How it came to rest at the foot of the Bodhi tree, no one can say with certainty. The precise history is unverified, and accounts differ. Some suggest it was left behind by looters who found the sandstone too heavy or too awkward to carry off. Others hold that it simply fell where the temple was ruined and lay there through the long decades of neglect. What is not in doubt is what happened next. In the years of abandonment, a Bodhi tree took root in the ruins, and as it grew, its roots reached down and around and through the tumbled stone until they closed about the fallen head and lifted it over generations back toward the light. A face held now in a cradle of a living wood, the tree and the stone grown into a single inseparable thing. There is something in the arrangement that resists mere accident, though accident it surely was. The roots seem to swallow the Buddha head, and yet they fail to shroud its face, winding about the crown and the sides and the base, but leaving the serene features clear, the half-closed eyes and the faint inward smile untouched, as if the tree itself had drawn back at the last from the sacrilege of covering the face of the enlightened one. Whether one reads intention into it or not, the effect upon those who come to stand before it is the same. The stone that human violence struck down, nature has lifted up and preserved, and the face that an army sought to erase gazes out still from within its wooden embrace, more famous now in its ruin than it ever was upon its intact body. This is a different kind of mystery than the ones we have chased across ocean and mountain, and it asks a different kind of question. At every other stop we press against the how they moved the basalt, how they carved the tuff, how the statues walked. Here the how has an answer, and it is a brutal one. An army with weapons and torches, and afterward a tree with time. What the head at Wat Mahathat presses upon us instead is the why and the after. Why do we carve faces in stone at all? What compels a civilization to spend its labour and its genius turning rock into a countenance, whether the serene face of a god or the fierce portrait of a king? and to set that face to watch over the living and the dead? And what becomes of those faces when the culture that made them is broken, when the kings are dead and the priests are scattered and the meaning that the stone once carried has drained away into the silence? Standing before the tree-held head, in the humid stillness of the Thai afternoon, with the ruins of the great capital spreading brick red and broken all around, one feels the tour's central obsession turn upon itself. We have marvelled at the making. Now we are asked to sit with the unmaking, with the decapitation and the fire and the patient roots, with the truth that even the most colossal and most sacred of stone faces is, in the end, a thing that can be toppled, abandoned, forgotten, and swallowed. The Buddha's face endures at Wat Mahathat not because it was too strong to be destroyed, but because destruction, having done its work, moved on, and something slower and gentler took the ruin in its keeping. The stone remembers, the tree remembers, and the face, half swallowed and wholly serene, remembers most of all. From this meditative pause, this quiet contemplation of ruin and reclamation, the tour must gather itself for one final ascent, the most audacious feat of logistics on the entire route, staged not on a coast or a plain, but on the bare summit of a mountain, 7,000 feet above the world, where a king who would be a god carved his own immortality into the sky. But before we make that final climb, before we set our feet upon the mountain where a king built his tomb among the stars, there is a question we have carried with us from the very first stop that must now be answered plainly, or at least confronted honestly. It is a question that has haunted every joint and every curve and every impossible ton of stone we have examined. If these works were so difficult, if the tools were so poor and the challenges so extreme, then what happens when we try, today, with all our knowledge and all our humility, to do the same? What happens when a modern sculptor, a trained expert with a lifetime of experience in shaping stone, sets aside the diamond saw and the pneumatic chisel and the power grinder, and picks up instead a hammerstone, a chip of obsidian, a wooden wedge, and a handful of sand, and attempts to make what the ancients made? The answer, gathered from decades of experimental archaeology across every continent we have visited, is as startling as any anomaly we have yet encountered. The answer, again and again, is a confession. Begin with the basalt, because basalt is where the confession is loudest. The Olmec colossal heads, carved between roughly 1200 and 900 years before the Common Era, some weighing as much as 25 tons in their sheer boulder form, others reaching still greater masses, were shaped not from a forgiving material, but from one of the most punishing stones on the surface of the earth. Basalt is volcanic rock, born of cooled lava, dense and hard and unyielding. It is the stone that dulls steel. Modern sculptors who work it with contemporary equipment speak of it with a kind of wary respect, of blades worn smooth in hours, of edges lost to its resistance, of the way it fights the tool at every stroke. And this is the stone that the Olmec chose. Not the softer limestones that lay closer to hand, not the sandstones that yield to patient rubbing, but basalt, the hardest thing available, hauled 60 miles and more from the slopes of the Tuxtla Mountains, and then transformed into a human face. Consider what that transformation required. The Olmec heads are not crude approximations of a countenance. They are portraits, rendered with a naturalism that startles the eye even now, the cheeks full and fleshy, the lips heavy and slightly parted, the eyes lidded with an expression that seems to hover between authority and weariness. The headdresses are carved with symmetrical precision, each element balanced against its twin, each band and glyph placed with evident intention. This is the work of artists who knew exactly what they wanted and possessed the means to achieve it, working in a medium that punishes every error and forgives nothing. And they did it, as far as all the evidence tells us, with stone hammers, with tools of harder stone struck against the softer, with obsidian for the fine work, and with sand and water rubbed endlessly across the surface to bring the final polish. No metal, no wheel, no mechanical advantage of any kind that we can identify. Just hands and time, and a mastery so complete that it looks to us like magic. Sculptors who have attempted to reproduce this work report a consistent and humbling set of failures. They can, with effort, remove basalt using a hammerstone, pecking away at the surface flake by flake, a technique the ancients almost certainly used. But the process is agonizingly slow, and the control it offers is coarse. To bring a rough boulder down to the fleshy subtlety of an Olmec cheek, to render the curve of a lip that seems almost soft to the touch, to achieve the mirror symmetry of a headdress on a stone that resists every stroke. These are the tasks at which the modern hand falters. It is not that the thing is theoretically impossible. It is that the sheer accumulation of labour, the thousands upon thousands of controlled strikes, the years of patient abrasion, the intimate knowledge of how this particular stone breaks and yields, together represent an investment of skill and time and coordinated effort that few today are willing or able to make. How many labour years does a single colossal head represent? How many strikes of stone on stone, how many hours of grinding sand across an unforgiving surface to turn a shapeless volcanic boulder into the immortal face of a king? And what does it say that we, with all our advantages, quietly set the challenge aside as more than we can manage? The Moai of Rapa Nui pose the puzzle in a different register, though the underestimation runs just as deep. Here the stone itself is kinder. The volcanic tuff of Rano Raraku is soft when freshly quarried, workable with the basalt hand tools the islanders wielded, hardening only with exposure to the air. The Easter Island statue project and other experimental efforts have gone a long way toward answering the hardest of the Moai's logistical riddles. Trials have confirmed what the oral tradition insisted all along, that the statue's D-shaped bases and forward-leaning centres of gravity were not accidents, but deliberate engineering, that a monolith of many tons could indeed be rocked and swung and walked upright across the island by teams of coordinated haulers, worked side to side like a refrigerator shuffled across a kitchen floor. The method, once dismissed as fantasy, now stands vindicated in principle, and yet vindicating the principle only sharpens the deeper wonder. For the walking explains the transport, but it does not diminish the achievement, it magnifies it. To walk a statue across miles of broken volcanic terrain, you must first carve it with a centre of gravity so precisely placed that it will rock without toppling, lean without falling, move forward without shattering against the ground. That is not brute labour. That is applied physics, mastered without a written equation, encoded instead in the shape of the stone itself. And beyond the single statue lies the staggering scale of the whole. Nearly 1,000 moai, carved from a single crater over some 2.5 centuries, each requiring the sustained effort of many hands, each demanding not only the carving but the moving and the raising upon its ahu. The labour years involved defy easy comprehension. This was not the work of idle craftsmen, but the organising obsession of an entire society, generation after generation pouring its energy into the making of ancestral faces. The symmetry of a moai's features, the consistency of the long straight nose and the deep-set eyes, and the elongated ears across hundreds of separate statues carved by hands, separated by decades. This speaks to a canon, a tradition, a transmitted knowledge held in common and refined across lifetimes. How does a society coordinate such a thing? How does it sustain the will, over 10 or 12 generations, to keep carving, keep walking, keep raising the faces of the dead? The San Agustin figures of the Colombian cloud forest, carved across a vast span reaching from before the Common Era into the medieval centuries, some rising 14 feet from the wet earth, demonstrate a comparable mastery over volcanic stone and pose a comparable challenge to any who would repeat it. Here too the finishing is the marvel, the way the hard volcanic rock has been coaxed into fanged mouths and staring eyes, and the interlocked forms of guardian and ancestor, surfaces worked and smoothed and detailed in a mountain forest thick with mist and rain, and the constant labour of decay. To carve such figures with stone tools in such a place, and then to set them as sentinels over the graves of the honoured dead, required not only skill, but a devotion that binds the living to the buried across the centuries. And the culture that did it left no name we can be certain of, no script, no clear account of itself, so that the statues stand as their own only testimony, silent witnesses to an artistry we can measure but cannot fully explain. Run the thread through every stop and it converges upon a single point, spoken not by the dreamers on the fringe but by the people best qualified in all the world to judge, the working sculptors and the experimental archaeologists who have taken up the ancient tools and tried in good faith to match the ancient hands. Their verdict is not that aliens came, nor that some vanished super race left these works behind. Their verdict is subtler and, in its way, far more staggering. It is that we have profoundly underestimated the people who actually did this. The word primitive, applied to the Olmec or the islanders of Rapa Nui, or the forest carvers of San Agustin, is not merely unkind. It is wrong, a category error of the most fundamental sort. As one experimental archaeologist put it, with the weary clarity of someone who has stood sweating over an intractable block of stone, the more primitive the tools, the more advanced the project management. Strip away the machines, and what remains is not incapacity but its opposite, a mastery of organization, of knowledge, of patience and coordination and transmitted skill that our own age, for all its power, would struggle to reproduce. We can move 100 tons with a crane in an afternoon. We cannot easily reproduce the society that moved it with rope and song and the collective will of a people. That is the confession at the heart of this tour, and it reframes everything. Where we came expecting to find limitation, we find instead a kind of genius we had forgotten how to recognize. And so we come at last to the summit, to the boldest logistical gambit on the entire route, staged where no coast or plain could soften the difficulty, on the bare crown of a mountain in ancient Anatolia, 7,000 feet above the surrounding lands. In the 1st century before the Common Era, a king named Antiochus I of Commagene, ruler of a small kingdom wedged between the great powers of his age, conceived an ambition that dwarfed his realm. He would build his tomb upon the highest peak he could command, and he would surround it not merely with statues but with gods, colossal seated figures of himself among the deities of both the Greek and Persian worlds he claimed as his ancestry, each carved from stone, each raised on a terrace atop the mountain, each crowned with a head as large as a small house. To reach the summit of Nemrut Dar, the workers hauled stone up the punishing slopes, and there, in the thin cold air where the wind never rests, they raised the god-king and his divine companions to gaze out over the world he wished to rule forever. Time and earthquake have since done to Antiochus what the Burmese army did to the Buddhas of Ayutthaya. The colossal heads have toppled from the bodies that once bore them, and they lie now upon the terraces scattered and immense, their features weathered but still commanding, staring up at a sky they were meant to survey from on high. To stand among them at dawn, as the first light climbs over the eastern peaks and touches the fallen faces one by one, is to feel the full weight of the king's ambition and the full irony of its outcome. He built his monument to defeat death, to make himself a god remembered for all ages upon the roof of his kingdom. The kingdom is gone, dissolved into the empires that swallowed it. The king is a footnote, but the heads remain, and they draw travellers now from across the earth to a summit where nothing else survives, so that in a strange and unintended way the god-king's gamble against oblivion has half succeeded. He is not worshipped, he is not remembered as he wished, but his face is still there, 7,000 feet up, watching the sun rise over a world that has utterly forgotten what he was. This is the pattern, then, that has repeated itself at every stop of our long journey, across peoples who never met, who spoke unrelated tongues, who worshipped different gods and lived in different ages and knew nothing whatever of one another. In the humid lowlands of the Mexican Gulf Coast, in the misted highlands of the Colombian Andes, on the loneliest inhabited island in the vast Pacific, in the fallen capital of the Siamese kings, and on a windswept Anatolian summit, the same impulse rose, again and again, unbidden and unconnected. The impulse to take the hardest, most enduring material the earth could offer and to shape it into a face. Not a tool, not a wall, not a weapon, but a countenance, human or divine, a ruler or an ancestor or a god, set up to look out upon the living and the dead and to endure when everything softer had crumbled away. Why do we carve our faces in stone? The tour began by pressing on the how, and the how has led us stop by stop to a mystery of the will rather than the hand. For the astonishing truth is that none of it was efficient. There were easier stones to carve, closer quarries to work, lighter monuments to raise. Every one of these cultures chose the difficult path deliberately, chose the hardest material and the greatest scale and the most punishing logistics, and poured into that choice a share of its wealth and labour and genius so large that it can only be explained by something beyond the practical. The point was never efficiency. The point was permanence and meaning and the defiance of death. The Olmec held that the head was the vessel of the soul, and so they made the heads of their rulers vast and imperishable, that the soul of a king might outlast his flesh. The islanders of Rapa Nui set their ancestors' faces upon the shore to gaze inland, watching over the villages of their descendants, the dead keeping faith with the living. The forest carvers of San Agustin stationed their stone guardians over the graves of the honoured, so that no one who mattered would ever be left unwatched. And a king on an Anatolian mountain reached for godhood itself, in the only material that might carry his name past the ruin of his kingdom. Return, for a moment, to the tree-held Buddha in the ruins of Wat Mahathat, that serene sandstone face cradled in the roots of the Bodhi tree, gazing out from its wooden embrace with the half-closed eyes and the faint inward smile that no army could erase, and set beside it, in the mind's eye, a single moai standing upon its platform on a far Pacific shore, its back to the endless ocean, its face turned steadily inland toward the land of the living. These two faces, half a world apart, made by peoples who never dreamed of one another's existence, say the same thing in the same silence. They say that a face in stone is a promise against forgetting. They say that meaning, once carved deeply enough, can outlast the meaning's makers. The Buddha endures because destruction, having done its worst, moved on, and something patient took the ruin in its keeping. The moai endures because a people needed their ancestors to keep watch, and made that watch out of the bones of a volcano. The questions do not close. We still do not know, with certainty, how the Olmec brought their basalt across 60 miles of river and swamp and forest. We do not fully understand how the last moai left the quarry, nor why the carving stopped, nor what silenced the culture of the cloud forest and carried its name beyond our reach. At each site the answers thin out into speculation, and the stone keeps its deepest counsel. And even as we press for those answers, the faces themselves are slipping from us in another way, for basalt cracks and tuff erodes and sandstone crumbles, and mountain frost splits the fallen heads a little further apart each winter. These monuments were made to defy time, and they have defied it longer than any of us can imagine. But they are not immortal, and the work of keeping them, of studying and preserving and simply protecting these colossal witnesses from the slow attrition of the years, goes on quietly at every stop we have visited, a race against the very permanence the ancients sought. In the end, that permanence is the thing that lingers. These faces have outlasted their makers by a span that beggars the imagination. The Olmec kings dust for 3,000 years, the walking statues carvers gone, the forest guardians people vanished into the mist, the Siamese court scattered, the god-king of the mountain forgotten. Everything that surrounded these faces has fallen away. The empires, the priests, the meanings, the names. Only the faces remain, and they have undergone a quiet reversal that is perhaps the greatest mystery of all. They were made to watch over the living. Now the living are gone, and the faces watch over us, the latecomers, the tourists and scholars and dreamers who climb the mountain and cross the ocean to stand before them. We came to look at them, but it has been the other way around all along. Carved by hands we have underestimated in a material we can barely master, for reasons we can only half recover, these colossal faces have kept their vigil across the ruin of everything that made them, and they are watching us still.